Previously on Chisel This, Mateo cooked up a recipe for a literary war. What seemed to be differences in semantics on the surface was revealed to be two multi-layered cakes with similar tastes, but a world's difference in ingredients. On today's episode, Mateo will analyze two very different cakes, and while both are still cakes, one is on fire, and the other is 103 years old. Ladies and gentlemen, your host, culinary cuisine chiseler connoisseur, Matt Furio!
Thank you, welcome. Welcome to Chisel This. My name is Mateo. I'll be your host today. So today we're examining the ingredients. There's pepper coming out of this. That's not good. So today we're examining the ingredients of a rap battle of epic proportions. Throughout history, a fondness for food fabricated its own genre of entertainment. At the hallmark of its conception, we find Mrs. Julia Child, famous for emigrating cuisine from France into the land of the free. Flash forward 30 years of grandmothers developing diabetes just from sitting on the couch all day and watching Food Network, and we have Gordon Ramsay, a well-deserved braggadocious chef. He is now a television connoisseur, having abused the format that Mrs. Child laid out for him. They were pitted against each other in a rap battle that is funny by nature, only because their similarities and differences were exploited meticulously, as if preparing such a delicate meal. Now before we begin cooking, ladies and gentlemen, you want to preheat your audience with an anticipatory swell of excitement, showcasing what we'll be making today. Everything from filet mignon to some herbs to some herb berry jam will excite your audience enough to have them hooked through the end, even waiting through commercials. And we know that's what it's all about. Before we begin, here is a list of ingredients that are necessary to make your battle tasteful as possible. First, you will need opponents who will draw several metaphors to different cooking utensils and food products. This is not a food product, but you get the idea.
I keep my ovens preheated and my pilot's greenlit. I'm a seasoned skillet, you're a Pam sprayed pan. Rolling in dough like beef Wellington from Hollering, and I'm shitting on you like I'm workflow intolerant. I could freeze a steak with those frosted tips. Punch you on the head, melt you, and stick it to you. Anything's good with enough butter.
Even more so, you will need chefs who understand rap culture and implement culinary rhetoric into common rap prompts.
You can rap your way out of a pastry bag. Understand? I'll open up on you like a fine red wine. Drop the bull, you bait. Yes, chef. Call me no chef. I've got this in the bag.
You must implement methods of cooking, such as those based on time, into lyrical scenarios.
Here's a nice move. Take a pour, abuse you. Set a 30-year timer. Voila! Huge draw. Dash, you're past your expiration date.
Does anyone know how to close a drawer? And there's more that don't fit into a category, but we'll pick them up as we go, if I can get this out of the drawer. Now, both characters have flaws that the others will exploit. The stakes are higher in this battle for a character to be on the defensive rather than the offensive. For example, Ramsay must justify his behavior as a leech for success. He does this by bragging about his Machiavellian pursuits of fame. Julia Child is rather humble and cares more about the art than she does the game. Today, she is obviously less relevant in media than Ramsay, and she also has to make the case that the legacy she left behind is better than any legacy that Ramsay will create in the amount of time he has left to live. The next step in baking the CRB is to introduce a reason for the characters to be battling each other. This battle starts off by doing something a bit different.
And that's how you make a perfect risotto. Right. Mrs. Child, welcome to the grown-ups table. I've got exactly 2 minutes, and you should be grateful, because I'm in the fucking weed.
Toss some exciting spices into there, if you know what I mean. The actual reasoning for the battle doesn't come till the end of Julia Child's first verse, but Ramsay does do something important in the very beginning. You see, the battle begins before the battle actually begins, as evidenced by a singular out-of-measure line that Ramsay says directly to a camera.
And that's how you make a perfect risotto. Right.
And now we get a little taste of how good the accent is going to be. We'll see if it can keep its consistency throughout the time we need to bake it. Now, this sequence implies not why they're battling, but the implications of how their battle is starting. We are not just thrown into it like previous battles, rather, we are introduced to a character who supposedly has yet to be introduced to his opponent. After hastily finishing the last sentence from his own cooking show, we get a glimpse of what living in the limelight is like. Caught up in the heat of being a busy celebrity, Ramsay goes directly from one thing to the next, while an entire crew accommodates the turnaround needed to accomplish this. It's very routine, and each of them is comfortable in the role of keeping Ramsay on the clock. Now, this scene paints a picture that carries extra disses than the actual lyrics yield. It insinuates he's taking time out of his busy schedule to rap battle her, which simultaneously raises him and demotes her on a subjective level. He looks at the clipboard and searches for the name of whichever person he's supposed to meet next on his agenda for today, insulting her fame by insinuating he doesn't particularly know of her. This also implies that Ramsay is so prestigious and busy Ramsay that his PR team is the body that sets up things for him, and he doesn't know nor care about what he's going to do that day until the very second he's about to do it. That's how the fame works. You go from one thing to the next. Trust me, I would know. Chisel the studios, I mean, just people are booking interviews left and right. I don't even know where to begin. On this clipboard, he sees Mrs. Child, a clear oxymoron, and invites this child to the metaphorical grown-ups table, where real culinary mastery is achieved. He only has 2 minutes until his next gig, mind you, and he makes that clear by identifying how he abuses the industry. He's at the point where he's too big to fail, just swallowing everything that comes his way. He just keeps pumping out shows, and ERB gives 3 fan-made examples of these shows, just to show how monotonous and random the shows will start sounding if he doesn't just stop making so many already. Let me tell you something, if there's any way to make the real world work in a series that 99.9% of the time uses green screen footage to build their own world, this is it! Everything moves so fluidly and fast enough to cover the parts of the scenery that wouldn't necessarily fit in. You know, in fact, much of what Ramsay creates is in a studio, and considering that they film the epic rap battles at Maker Studios, which is a real studio, it actually makes sense for things in the background to be there. Also notice how the makeup artist covers his face when he says the lines that overlap each other.
Welcome to the grown-ups table. Exactly 2 minutes.
Which would make for an awkward mouth movement if they hadn't have done that. This entire sequence is choreographed perfectly with people maneuvering in and out of each other. It's so smooth, like I can't believe it's not butter, you know? Now Ramsay's first verse follows the same mantra throughout. He's rich, he's famous, and he's busy. 3 things that keep him above Child without even having to rap at her. He is quite literally rolling in dough as the fillets in beef Wellington are rolled in dough, and uses things like that as his safety net when he does nothing but mock Child's appearance. Speaking of appearances, Lloyd does good in this segment with making the face yelling unique, as his face turns red and his eyes grow gray and beady. Now we'll stick his first performance in the oven right now. Bring it back out in, let's say,
4
minutes and
57
seconds.
Isn't that a wonderful thing?
I think Julia Child's first 4 lines are where people decide whether or not she won. Now when you watch these things on the first try, if you just focus on the subtitles to see what they're saying, and you're only seeing the lyrics and not necessarily her performance, just pepper all over the floor, you will realize that these 4 lines don't necessarily progress the story forward. That and the difficulty of understanding her words might turn you off from her entire character. However, if you're watching just the character performance, I think it sets the stage for you to appreciate what is to come. And the first thing that she does is identify the contrasting character from Ramsay. I think the entire progression of this point comes from her attitude, where she rejects all of Ramsay's self-proclamations of success as just juvenile wishful thinking on part of his bad temper.
A grumpy little chef who thinks he can bring enough stuff to justify getting wrong.
When I first saw this, I absorbed her faces, I lathered in her voice, and I soaked in her body language. Cooking, doing things cooking-ishly, and I was hooked on the idea that they brought to this character. A woman who talks very uniquely and old-fashioned-ish, and makes very animated faces to display her emotions. And the interpretation is so unique just because of the way she owns it. The best roles are when someone is happy and comfortable with it. It allowed her to explore different kinds of facial expressions and vocal inflections that really only come out when somebody is just acting out of a pure rush of adrenaline. I had a similar experience when I played Pee Wee Herman in epic rap battle parodies, and I credit most of my faces and vocal inflections as a brainchild of the adrenaline that rushed through my body just from owning my character and getting inside his head.
Override your bicycle with my bicycle!
That pepper is kind of making me choke a little bit. She does that insanely well here, making this role one where she is representing someone else, Julia Child, in the form of a brand new character unique to the series, born from her talents as an individual. You'll come back to watch epic rap battles Julia Child, not a by-the-books factual representation of the actual Julia Child, because frankly that's not entertaining. Most times ERB exaggerates traits in a character to make them entertaining, and this role, like Picasso and Bill Nye and Stephen King, have added more unique nuances to make the character stable, impressionable, and memorable as an individual character.
I rock hard as concrete on top of these bomb beats.
Her next 4 lines are aesthetically pleasing, but like I said earlier, they still haven't progressed any of her points forward yet. She continues to reinforce her tenure over Ramsay by connecting age to skill, but it's not going to be enough to win for her. It's a non sequitur. Sure, old people have more opportunities to become wise because they've experienced more things, but it's really a fallacy. It's a non sequitur. Of course, when you have the tenure, you're always going to use it over the opponent, because anything that you can exaggerate will work to your advantage. But on an objective scale, it doesn't weigh down the other opponent too much. Now she starts amping up the competition.
Go on and cross your arms in that b-boy stance. When it comes to hot cuisine, there's one F-word. French!
She belittles his claim to fame, which is saying the F-word, by declaring how a different F-word, France, served as a vehicle for her to become naturally renowned for her talent. I also think it's interesting how the word hot sounds like hot, and hot cuisine can be likened to Hell's Kitchen. Next, she says the best sequence of lines in the entire battle.
Here's a nice amuse-bouche. Take a pour, abuse, use. Set a 30-year timer. Voila!
Now listen, you can't make this battle without parodying the step-by-step nature of a cooking show. The host guides the audience through the process of creating food, and we show you things, and we tell you how long they're gonna take, and we put them in the oven, do a little time lapse. It's made to order. The reason that this iteration is so powerful is because it's both a hyperbole and a repurposing of that sentiment. I'm still itchy from this pepper. Now we're under the impression that she's describing how to make food until she gets to the finished product. It transforms halfway into a metaphor that describes in 3 steps or less how to summarize the character that is Gordon Ramsay. It also gets down to the brass tacks of Ramsay's anger. He was subjected to a rough childhood, and that is easy to blame for his temper, whether or not it has any real connection. Add that to a perfect double rhyme scheme and you have a beautiful sequence of lyricism. I would just like to point out that something I noticed by the person who put this on Rap Genius, all of the pejoratives that rhyme with Ramsay are under the definition wimp in the Oxford Dictionary. Coincidence? Now at the end of Child's first verse, we get the reasoning for the battle. Laughing and creating versus berating and destroying. Joy versus fear. And how each used their own respective methods to become a successful chef. Both clearly worked, but only one will walk away with the moral high ground, and only one will walk away with a tangible monetary advantage. Now at this point, you may have forgotten that Ramsay was even in this battle yet. Child's first verse has double the amount of bars that Ramsay's does. So as of right now, it feels like Julia Child is owning the battle. She already said so much, and Ramsay's first verse didn't do much to diss Child, rather it was just boasting about himself. He has big shoes to fill in a second verse. Let's see if he brings it.
I'm glad you got that off your giant flabby chest. I'd call you donkey, but you look more like Shrek.
As opposed to Child's stark juxtaposition and energy from Ramsay's end of his first verse to Child's beginning of her first verse.
Workflow intolerant! Isn't that a wonderful thing?
Ramsay picks up his second verse with the cool down that Julia Child laid out for him.
It's less conscious than joy. I'm glad you got that.
I think the reason that they pointed out the donkey and Shrek comparison is because Ramsay's accent sounds a lot like Shrek. When he says donkey in the show, and even more so right here in this instance of the rap battle, it sounds like Shrek saying donkey. So you hear something that sounds like Shrek saying donkey, and then you hear him say Shrek. So it snaps in your brain and you laugh at it. I think these two lines, while they are funny, display an insecurity for Ramsay. This is the second and third time he's made fun of Julia Child's size, and he just started his second verse. When he's resorting to ad hominem attacks, instead of breaking down the bare bones of the argument, it sounds like he can't fight back on the turf that Child brought the argument to. This happens a lot in real life, especially when debating someone who doesn't know a lot about the subject. Instead of retorting the philosophy that Child proposed with her last few lines, Ramsay immediately reverts to juvenile name calling. It's like Child gave him a chance, and then he just, there's no helping him anymore. This is all he's gonna do for the whole time.
Your giant flabby chest.
You see, it's not a fault of the writers, it's actually a good thing. It makes sense because Ramsay's insults in his TV show are directed towards the people cooking, not actually the food that they cooked. If we're talking about knowing a character enough, to the point where you're including character flaws as a part of his decision making, they got it.
When the Iron Man chef busts a rhyme, I'll open up on you like a fine red wine.
Now I enjoy how they have Ramsay in the background here exercising his feelings of disgust as he normally does on the show. He often does this as well as manhandling the chefs and their failed dishes. So it's nice to see him treating Julia Child like a contestant on a show. At this point, I think visually we start to lose the character we saw in the beginning. I'm not sure why he's sharpening his knife downward. Isn't that a safety hazard or something? But he motions it to the point where there's like an awkward inconsistency. I think if he was going like this, a little slower, it would have been a lot more menacing. You see, Lloyd is visibly more focused about making these motions than he is about the face he's making at that point, because it has no dynamic range here. Julia Child is very good at making her facial expressions fresh to make up for the lack of action happening, but that doesn't happen with Ramsay in much of his second verse. It's a very static state of anger. And while you can argue that that's good and it embodies the character well, if we're looking at just his face, we're not seeing much happening and everything else is where the action is. The best moments are when there's action happening everywhere.
Regurgitating French plates like a glorified translate.
Ramsay kind of gets his faces back at this part. The French plates line is a great repurpose tool, as he uses the bodily function of regurgitating in relation to food, now as a method of calling child trite and unoriginal, as if she stole something from someone else, put it in a different medium, and called it hers. It's always fun to call someone a glorified version of an otherwise unexciting profession, because it demotes them not only off the platform in which they stand, but strips her out of her field, places her on a lower pedestal, and then knocks her off of that pedestal.
Fresh, you're past your expiration date.
This short line right here is not something to glaze over. In fact, it writes itself. Fresh is a rapper's staple brag word, but here it has a very degrading meaning to child. Ramsay is fresh like fresh food. He's ready to be used now, today. He's at his high point at the time of this battle, and just the fact that this battle is happening at this convenient time gives him the timely advantage to make this kind of comparison. Child, on the other hand, is literally past her expiration date. Not only does he say her style is outdated and not fitting with modern cuisine, but her life has literally expired. There's no comeback for Child once Ramsay bests her, because she's not around anymore to adapt to a new climate or fill a modern niche. Meanwhile, Ramsay has filled several of those, and it's a very powerful one-up he has over her just from being in the right place at the right time.
Alright, fuck it. Blue team, drop the bull, you bait.
Now the blue team comes in. I think it's genius to have a bunch of lackeys doing the work for Ramsay, because in many of his shows, he's not the one who's always cooking. I think Child could have used that plot point to her advantage somewhere, suggesting he is enslaving his workers, but it also works really well as an evident Easter egg throughout the entire battle, where many randoms are seen doing the dirty work for their king.
I've seen your little show and it sure ain't pretty. One part Big Bird, two parts Miss Piggy.
This line here is a really neat comparison, but I think it has the old Matt Forio problem. What I mean is that the wording of the line doesn't exactly give you enough evidence to figure out exactly what they're referring to. I've seen your show, and that show is 1 part Big Bird, 2 parts Miss Piggy. Well, what part of Big Bird and Miss Piggy does this show have traits of? By asking ourselves several questions, we can determine that he's actually referring to Julia Child's appearance again, and not the actual show. So the wording of the line leads us in one direction, to assume that the show has some traits of Big Bird and Miss Piggy, or Sesame Street and the Muppets, but then we have to take a few steps back, and take a different route to find the answer, and a place where that line only hinted that we should go. We can derive by merely guessing, with no concrete evidence in the lyrics, that Ramsay is suggesting that Child is as large as Big Bird, looks like Miss Piggy, and sounds like Miss Piggy. That's what I'm getting out of it. Now that's a really interesting comparison to make, and if you word that right, it could be a super demolishing point. I've seen your little show and it sure ain't pretty. That line doesn't exactly paint a picture for us to see what he means when he's saying 2 different characters' names here. And I get that those are 2 Child show characters, but I think therein lies the possible layup line to replace the one that they used. This Child show has only 1 character, and that character is composed of traits from 1/3 Big Bird, 2/3 Miss Piggy. Now obviously lyricize that, but that's the intention that they have to go in. I also think that you can add another meaning in there by referring to the parts of Big Bird and the parts of Miss Piggy as ingredients. So you say, the recipe for this one character in this ridiculous Child show is a sprinkle, 1/3 of Big Bird, and 2 dashes, 2/3 of Miss Piggy. I think that's what they're trying to say. And if they included the term Child show in the layup line, not only would it be a double entendre with Julia Child show and a show for children, insinuating that her show is not mature enough to match up to Ramsay's, but it would have created that silhouette, that outline for us to see, could be filled and immediately understood by the following line. See, most rap battle lines provide a general image in the layup line, and then the second line uses certain words to color by number until we see the full picture. Some lines work in the reverse way, where we get the full picture and then we get the ingredients of it in the next line. I loved the concept, but I would have liked to seen it formatted a little better to include other references instead of having a blank layup line and then go into something very vague. And this is a recurring problem that we see in this battle because they have more room to waste room. The battle has a lot of lines in it. They go on for a while. They create these scenarios that require longer amounts of filler lines to implement. So when you have this idea for a really good line, and then you don't know how to connect it to what's before and what's after it, you create another couplet or 4-bar sequence where the first 1 or 3 bars only exist to pad the remaining space needed to fill the real estate needed to get to that final punchline. You see it happen a little bit here. But basically the concept is that they have more room to waste room here. And that's okay if you're going to use a lot of room to get to all your points, and if you hit all those points, it makes for a great rap battle, which this was. But overall, they serve a purpose greater than what you would take them for at face value. As the sequence continues, we get a nice continuous shot that details the hectic nature of Hell's Kitchen. It slowly zooms out and reveals more of the spacing to bring us into this new setting. Having delegated harsh work to his minions, Ramsay can spend more time dissing Child while the serfs get his work done. If we're comparing the very beginning of his second verse to the end of it, you have that nice slope where he's going from calm to overheated. But in the heat of this moment, he elevates to one state of anger and then plateaus until he whips out the jacket. They did a good job in theory of making him angry and setting up this scenario to put him in, which is reminiscent of the actual show. I mean, the eyebrows are always on fleek. When he says it's rubbish, I want to see him furious. I want to see him light up in flames, and I want to see his face explode, but it stays the same from the lines before it.
I mean, it's rubbish!
However, he does definitely pick it back up towards the end of the verse.
You call these raw? They're stale and soft!
Now, I found the term raw very interesting because it's kind of an oxymoron. Ramsay uses it with a negative connotation in his show. He calls people's food raw, and he says the F word before it, but in the rap genre, raw has a positive connotation. My raps are raw, yo. So when he rhetorically asks if Child calls her rhymes raw, then follows it up with 2 comparatively negative adjectives, the word raw becomes the positive word. So in the sense of rap, it makes sense, but in the sense of Ramsay himself saying it, it wouldn't make sense for him to use that word positively. I would have liked to seen the first line of that couplet end with him saying that the rhymes are F-word raw, getting really angry and having his face light up, and then whipping out the jacket. Now, if you watch this sequence with one pair of eyes, it looks fine. But there were some clear continuity errors, and I'm sure that they know this, and I'm not trying to nitpick. But I think this would have been easy to avoid if they choreographed it in the same way that they choreographed the opening sequence. Especially since Ramsay needed to do more things in this course of time than he did in the very beginning. You see how so many people had to walk in and out in that first scene. But when you're going through different angles here, everything pretty much needs to stay consistent. Because if you're looking directly at this book, which Ramsay has to pick up at some point, if you're not paying attention, you don't notice it. But when you are, you do.
Show when it sure ain't pretty. One part, big bird, what disease? I mean, it's rubbish! Yes, sure! Look at page 408! Tell me who—
It's not something that makes or breaks the battle, and I can't anticipate what kind of problems they actually encountered during this, so I'm just gonna say it could have been avoided, but maybe they had a good reason why they couldn't avoid it.
No, here, take this jacket! Now give it back and fuck off!
Now, if you guys haven't connected the dots yet, this segment is pure genius. But how so? We'll find out after these commercial messages. Did you see it? The build-up to Take This Jacket is like the anticipatory climaxing before the commercial segment on a drama show like Hell's Kitchen. Then they actually do a subtle commercial break by flipping the burger with the logo. So just to remind you what you're watching here, now that can be taken for either a commercial break or the logo of the show that transitions into a commercial break, but regardless, still genius. And then we return.
Now give it back and fuck off!
Ramsay tells Child that she's not even good enough to compete in one round of the show, doing to her exactly what he does to blundering chefs who make amateur mistakes. A big part of the show is threatening people to leave, like telling them to get out and cursing at them. And it's clear that he won't tolerate Mrs. Child either. Just like how he ends his first verse, his face gets beady-eyed and red. But this also proves that Ramsay has not listened to Child's criticism. His temper led him down the avenue of insulting to accomplish yet again. Child won't let him off easy with that.
Oh please, your defeat's guaranteed! Concede! I've got this in the bag! Sous vide!
Just like the first verses, Child reverses the energy as to assert her posterity and natural dominance. She gave him the chance to battle her on the grounds she provided. He denied, and that denial alone proves that Child has the moral high ground. The way she talks, it's like she's going into the bottom of the ninth having already won the game. Provided her ultimatum, he made a rash decision to revert to inflammatory measures, so she carries on with the moral trophy in her heart.
Michelin indeed, you've done well for yourself, but as a person, you couldn't get a star on you!
The concept of dynamic range also helps in lyrical comparisons. The line about Yelp is so simplistically funny, not just because of the way she looks when she says it, but because she demotes him to a platform that he would never be caught dead on. The dynamic range between Michelin ratings and Yelp is so vast that it sends him flying into the void where he can only flutter his arms back and forth.
You scream at women, but the fits that you're pitching make you the pissiest bitch in the kitchen.
Did the lack of Ramsay making a woman in the kitchen joke surprise you? Of course! Add that to the fact that Child turns that fact around on the hissy fitter, and that's delicious! A great tool for a rapper to use is when they accuse the other of holding the superlatory role in an already derogatory group of things. In this case, Child demotes Ramsay to a group that he could easily accuse her of being a part of, women in the kitchen. So not only does she turn a possible disadvantage around, but Ramsay gets belittled by never having actually used this disadvantage to his advantage. And this is not to say that being a woman is a disadvantage. Rather, what I mean is that she is a disadvantage for inherently belonging to a group that has a meme stigma, women belonging in the kitchen. By definition, Child would be in that group, and Ramsay would not be. But now he is!
Anything's good with enough butter.
The rest of these lines are metaphorical puns for Child's love of butter, and she gets unexpectedly angry before dropping the mics for her last lines.
Oh, I'm so glad you spent this time with me. Now eat a dick. Bon appetit!
While I love the execution, and while the D word is the best choice audibly, wouldn't it have made a lot more sense, bearing in the context for the situation they created, for her to say cock instead?
Bon appetit!
It would still work with the bone wordplay. It must be wordplay. Just a thought. I just love when an ending is climactic this way. The beat disappears, a bell echoes, and Child reinvokes her stable stature by offering up warm wishes as Ramsay departs. Child used to end her TV shows and her book by saying bon appetit, and offers it to Ramsay as a sign of peace. Who do you think wins when someone's being unreasonably angry, and then the opponent offers reasonable peace? That's what happens here, and Child makes clear that she has no intention of caring about whatever gig Ramsay has to go to next. She just sends him off in the humane way that she's familiar with, and that's it. Bon appetit! In the end, I think this battle did a lot of things right. The things it did wrong were just nitpicks in the grand scheme, and it was overall an excellent exploitation of cooking entertainment. If you haven't checked out any of my new original raps, click one of these to check them out. Otherwise, I'm Matt Foryo, and you just got chiseled. That's all for you today. And make sure you stay tuned for my album that's coming out this summer. You'll really enjoy it, and it's really unique. I'll give you a hint. I do a lot of things that other rappers say they can do, but better. I could eat.